Well, good evening, everyone. And welcome to our November program. It's nice to have you here. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that if you have questions, you can enter them in the chat at any time. And we'll take the questions at the end. And I wanted also to let you know about the plants that we sold from Urbanscapes Native Plant Nursery this year. We grew 2,000 plants and we sold or gave away 1,500 of the plants. So an outstanding summer at the nursery this year. And with that, let's get started with Ken Elkins from Audubon, Connecticut and the bend of the river. And Ken, go ahead, share your screen and let's hear what you have to say about attracting birds by the season.
Thanks, Dennis. Good evening, everyone. It's been a while since I've shared on Zoom. I felt like I was doing it multiple times a week, and now there's a gap, but I think especially with the weather changing, this is a great time to share again. My name is Ken Elkins. I'm the Community Conservation Manager for Audubon, Connecticut, and I'm also supporting the Bird Friendly Communities programs for Audubon, New York as well. Being a members of the Mononkatuk Audubon chapter, I think you're familiar that there are a few other Audubon chapters in Connecticut. They're the dark dots with a white center. And there are 27, I believe, in New York State. The orange dots are Audubon centers, where Audubon Greenwich was the first Audubon education center in the country, started in 1942. And we also have a center in the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge out in Western New York State. Green dots are where we have Audubon staff based at Cornell in Ithaca and in Albany, so that they're closer to helping with legislative issues in New York State. I'm based at that orange dot in Southbury. The bend of the river is in Southbury, so halfway between Waterbury and Danbury. We have 15 miles of trails. I recognize some of your names that have been able to have the pleasure of birding with you at the bend. And I hope all of you get the chance to visit that. We do have about 15 miles of trails. That many of them go through a mix of habitats almost immediately, so you can very quickly change from a meadow to a young forest to a hemlock grove and experience a difference in birds. And during the summer, Connecticut Butterfly Association leads many butterfly walks there as well. Today, we're going to chat about what birds need during each season, and that's going to help us figure out how we can attract birds to our backyards better. And then what plants in particular are going to be best to provide those seasonal needs. I do have the ability, and I'll explain how we can talk a little bit more about bird feeders along the way as well. Since we're in Zoom land and I usually feel like I'm talking too much, I've actually scheduled a few quick breaks for Q&A. So if you type a thought into chat at any point, I'll have a break coming up shortly so we can address those questions sooner rather than later throughout. Most people, when they think of attracting birds, they think of bird feeders. And I know that's how I got my start in birding, was my grandmother setting up bird feeders when I was a kid and getting to watch those goldfinches. And well, the feeders were in northern Vermont. So during the summer, there were rose-breasted grosbeaks and red-breasted nuthatches. And then the real winner of the group was the 15 evening grosbeaks that would come in on a daily basis. So it can be a great experience. And bird feeders, I've learned over the years, are actually more for us than they are for the birds. It's a way to place food so that we get to watch the birds at a spot where we can enjoy them from inside our house, whether in making it like a blind, so that way the birds aren't so scared of us while we're getting to observe them. We do have some challenges with setting up bird feeders, though. I think most of you this summer know that there was a mystery disease that went through some birds in Connecticut. It had started out in the Midwest and mid-Atlantic areas. And in July in particular, there were some birds that exhibited similar symptoms to those birds in other states, and we weren't sure whether bird feeders may have been involved, and at least having the birds congregate near them was something we didn't want that to be the case of causing any spread of disease, because there are other bird diseases that we know of, conjunctivitis in particular being one that we know feeders are the way it spreads from bird to bird the most. This summer, the birds that were getting sick were primarily recent fledglings, and they were medium-sized birds. We weren't noticing it very much in very small birds like chickadees and titmice as much as we were finding it in blue jays, robins, mourning doves, grackle-sized birds. It had a couple of unique features that it seemed a little bit like eye conjunctivitis in some ways, that it was making it harm their eyes and not being able to see, but also there were some other secondary infection things that made it really tough. And there still isn't a final answer on what exactly caused this last summer. But what we do know is that maybe we can figure out ways to attract birds without having the feeder per se. I will first point out that on Audubon's website, you can get, and we could email if we need to, we do have Audubon guides to bird seed, which ones to choose to attract which birds, which ones does each bird favor, what types of feeder styles certain birds prefer to eat from than others, and those ideas for how to be able to choose those to improve your backyard conditions. What I want to share about, though, is the concept of plants for birds. And what we do know is that birds need food, water, shelter, and the right amount of space. And by having a mix of plants in our backyards, we can provide that not just for birds who come to our feeders, but there are many other birds that are more interested in berries or in insects. And we then can enjoy a greater diversity of birds around us. And there's actually some data that shows that having a greater diversity of plants and animals around us is one of the indicators of increased well-being in humans, that we're happier and more generous when we have a greater diversity around us. If you haven't gotten the chance to pick up a book from Doug Tallamy, please consider adding that to your wish list for this holiday season. That he is an entomologist, but he puts a great spin on the concept that if we want more birds, we need more bugs. And he is able to figure out ways of creating the research of how we can figure out what insects are supporting birds during different parts of their life cycle and what plants those bugs prefer to eat off of, so that we can figure out how to increase the diversity around us and support birds better by choosing certain plants, just like we in our own personal diets look for those power foods. We can do that for birds too with the plants we choose. And the reason why the plants are the place for us to choose from is that the insects have all evolved and adapted abilities to eat certain plants, that plants all have defense mechanisms to try and prevent things from eating them. And different organisms have different ways of adapting to like the caterpillar here of a monarch butterfly can actually cut off the midrib, the vein on the back side of the leaf, and make the sap leak out. And then there's less sap and it's less toxic overall and easier to digest for them. So there's a lot of cool things that they've figured out what to do, but also it means that some of our bugs only want to eat certain plants. If we look at our calendar year and what birds need each season, in the spring, we think of birding and we think of migration, and those birds returning on migration, whether it's a short distance from Florida and the Gulf Coast or all the way from Costa Rica, regardless, they probably flew 150 miles last night. And when they do land here, and they need to rebuild muscle, and they need to start to prepare their bodies for the nesting season, which is going to provide different stresses on them. So we see these birds migrating through, and it's amazing how they can, as a group, locate proper spaces to feed. One of those things that they're keying in on are the blooming plants. And we have had different stopover habitat surveys where we've learned that certain plants are greening up along our shorelines of our rivers. So the birds come back along the Connecticut River Valley and the Farmington River Valley before they would be found on hilltops throughout central Connecticut, for example. One thing that they're looking for are the oak trees in particular, that they are blooming with those dangling little bits below the leaves are their flowers, and that there's lots of small insects attracted to those flowers. So the birds know to look for that, and then they've got a great spot to feed. So if we've got more oaks, we've got more warblers, and it is a great plant to have. It's not always one we get to choose to have in our yard, but as we're considering what we need to take down or replace, keeping those oaks around is a great choice. Here's a Magnolia Warbler feeding on those flower pieces, and this is actually from, it looks like a species of maple that it's trying to find some of those insects hiding in there. We're also learning some of the smaller warblers are even feeding on some of the pollen on those plants. Another great plant to have for spring migration are crabapple trees. While not truly native, there are some native apples to North America. It's surprising that crabapples overall support about 300 different species of caterpillars. And when those flowers are in bloom, there's also lots of other pollinators coming in attracted to those flowers. And then birds like orioles and cedar waxwings will actually eat the whole blossom to get the nectar out of it. Other flowering plants to think about for the spring, magnolias. Some of them are more native to regions south of Connecticut, but a few species are native to here, and the others are not invasive. Some of them bloom in April when there aren't many other things blooming yet, and through the end of April are great times for when the Baltimore Orioles are returning in particular. For the peak of spring migration, dogwoods are one of our best blooming trees, and dogwoods also support a lot of different species of caterpillars, and then we'll talk about them again at the end of the season, that their fruit are a great source of energy for their southbound migration in the fall. Dogwoods also happen to be, especially flowering dogwood, which is pictured here, are very tolerant of a lot of different conditions. So whether it's in a shady part of your yard or out in the sun, whether it's a wet area, or it might be a spot that is quite dry when there isn't much rain, this is a very hardy plant, and you see it found in landscaping a lot because it is a native that can change. It is very adaptable to the conditions around it. Memorial Day, I'm looking for Baltimore Orioles in the tulip trees. If I can identify where those tulip trees are, the blooms are usually quite up high in the tree, but those huge flowers, you can even see an ant in there trying to get to that sticky sap coming out of that flower, and its pollen is also a great source of food for a lot of insects. Tulip trees can grow large, but I want to mention these because they are sometimes overlooked as whether a tree to consider keeping or not in our yard. There are not as many flowers blooming in the early spring, but one in particular is wild columbine. In those red flowers, you can see the long tube where the nectar is hiding inside, so it can only be pollinated by certain long-tongued bumblebees and by hummingbirds. And those red colors is another indicator that birds are part of its life cycle because those bright colors are really only seen by birds. During the summer, if we want more birds close to our house, which is one of the peak seasons that people think about bird feeding, or you might not have bird feeders up because of bears in the neighborhood. Well, there are plenty of food sources we could have that would attract those birds that we could get to enjoy seeing them during that season when having bird feeders out is probably not a smart idea. And the primary thing that the adults are looking for is that they want sugar-filled fruits, and our fruits that are ripening that time of year in the early to midsummer are not full of fats. Instead, they are perfect for birds because just like a parent at 4 o'clock in the afternoon looking for an extra cup of coffee, those birds are looking for an energy source to go capture another dozen or so caterpillars before dark. The most abundant of our midsummer fruiting plants around here, and a really popular landscaping plant, is Amalankir. That is the genus for a plant that can be known as shadbush or shadblow or serviceberry, among a lot of other names. And there are some that can be small trees, some that are shrub form only, and their fruit are going to ripen usually in late June, early July. Great time for the birds. And if you can happen to find some ripening that the birds not eaten, they're actually quite tasty. Have a bit of a big pit, like a sense of relatives of cherries, but certainly a great source of food for birds. Wild blueberry may be one of the best bangs for your buck of spending your money to add something to support birds in your yard. We think of those berries as being delicious for us. They're ripening at the perfect time for those adult birds to have a food source that they need. And then we don't notice it very much, but there are almost 300 species of caterpillars, primarily small moths, that their caterpillars are feeding on the leaves of blueberry. We don't normally see a huge defoliation of blueberry bushes, but it's something that the birds notice. And I will see a variety of different warblers feeding through the blueberry bushes, not going for the berries, they're looking for the caterpillars in there. Also, for enjoyment in your yard, blueberry is also one of the most amazing of the fall foliage colors as well. That those dark reds and purples, we don't get in a lot of other shrubs. So in particular, if you've got some winged euonymus known as burning bush in your yard, the best thing to replace it with would be a wild blueberry bush. Cousin to the blueberries, not as high on the scale for landscaping value, but certainly valuable for birds, is huckleberry. A little bit lower growing generally and can tolerate more shade than some of the blueberries, and adds a little bit more diversity to the types of insects that might be feeding on it too. Usually pretty messy, letting it be a volunteer in the back section of your yard are the mulberries. Those big purple fruit can be extremely abundant. The foliage is really dense. Years ago, I had the privilege of living in the staff housing at the Connecticut Audubon Coastal Center at Milford Point. And there was a couple of big mulberry bushes, a couple out in the front yard, and there was one right out the back of my apartment window. And it seemed like in July, all the native neighborhood birds would drop off the fledglings in the mulberry bush. I wouldn't see adults, I would see fledglings, dozens of them, from the Orioles, the robins, the song sparrow, the horny doves, all of them in there. And the adults were all finding food elsewhere. Other days I'd get home and on the sidewalk where all the dropped fruit were, some of them had started to get a little bit fermented, and there I would find one or two of the mourning doves, usually purple all over the face and having a hard time walking straight. Having these berry bushes bring in birds that you're never going to see sitting at a bird feeder. Having cedar waxwings come and enjoy the fruit. Some of the flycatchers actually come in and will eat fruit. They aren't pure insectivores. so we can get to enjoy them when we've got some of these other fruit-bearing shrubs and trees. Might not be the prettiest tree in the yard, but for a bird feeder, it is a perfect choice to add. If you've got a shady spot and want something lower growing, red Bainberry is another, it is a little bit later in fruiting in the summer, but you, especially being in Southern Connecticut, might bloom and fruit a little bit earlier than say in other areas. And those, you might be more familiar with Doll's Eye or white Bainberry, grows out in the open more. This red one here is a great source, and the thrushes will seek it out during their fall migration too, if they haven't eaten it during the summer. Here's the white Bainberry as well. White being an indicator that we should not touch it. Both of the Bainberries are toxic to us. Also not usually at everyone's top of their landscaping choices, but an excellent choice to attract birds are the elderberries. This is black elderberry, and at the bend of the river, if you've seen our bird and butterfly attracting gardens, we usually let a volunteer of one of these grow, and then every 3 or 4 years we have to chop it out because it has pretty aggressive growth habits. Those berries are extremely abundant, and we can see everything from the gray catbirds and mockingbirds in there to red-eyed vireos coming down and yellow-throated vireos coming off of the edge of the forest and eating those berries late summer when they need some more energy to go catch some more caterpillars back in that mid-canopy. For us, we can enjoy those berries, especially in a variety of different drinks. The Bainberry also seems to be a preferred nesting and roosting location for birds like indigo buntings. Midsummer, we can't ignore having the right flowers around for birds like the ruby-throated hummingbird. Cardinal flower is a great choice to have. And here you can see on the left, there's a whole section of it that you can see the tall red candlestick appearance that they have. And this year when we couldn't have the feeders and we chose not to put out the hummingbird feeders either as setting the example, we still got to enjoy a lot of hummingbirds close to the office by having these plants in the garden spaces. Monarda is the genus. I suddenly blanked on the name. I usually keep all this stuff in my head. That come to me in a second, we can get to see hummingbird moths like this clear-winged snowberry moth, and the hummingbirds will love both the red and the more native purple varieties of wild bergamot is one of its other nicknames. So those are great choices to have, and I've noticed this year in particular, it bloomed a lot longer through the summer. So and there are bee balm, thank you, Michelle, is a more commonly used name for it. And the seeds are popular with many of the sparrows late in the season too. So if we want more birds around, we need more bugs. That we found caterpillars to be one of the most perfect baby bird foods. We always picture the robin catching the worms and bringing the worms back to the nest. But even for American robins and its cousin, the other thrushes, about 50% of the nestling's diet should be caterpillars or more than that. Because if we think about it, even in our own health, doctors tell us we need to eat more leafy greens, that we need all of those great pigments that turn in, like the carotenes are antioxidant qualities and also building blocks of other systems we need in our body. So we need to have those sources, and think about what the caterpillar just ate. It's leafy greens. It also happens to be in a nice soft package that baby birds can fit inside their gape and also digest fairly easily while their bodies are still developing. They will eat and find other insects, but these caterpillars in particular, most of them we would never notice, are a great source for them. Some caterpillars are big enough for us to see, like this 1.5 inch, almost, actually it's well over 2 inches long, when fully grown, is the Polyphemus moth. It's one of our largest moths in Connecticut. And it's amazing how camouflaged these caterpillars might be to us. We think that they may be reflecting different parts of the UV spectrum of light, and birds can see that. So they might be able to see caterpillars better than we expect. And it's not just the songbirds who are catching caterpillars. American kestrels will feed. Eastern screech owls spend a lot of their summer eating just insects. And down south in Texas, the eastern screech owl is pretty much an insectivore. It only eats insects and other small invertebrates. So which trees are better for attracting the caterpillars? Oaks, of course, that I mentioned earlier, are the king of that ability to attract caterpillars, that there are more species adapted for eating the leaves of the different species of oaks. So as a genus, there are over 500 species of moths and caterpillars, and moths and butterfly caterpillars that can feed on it. Another great one are willows. Cherries seem to be, especially because they grow near edges of forests where we have a higher diversity of birds, we're finding that there is a large number of birds who feed in cherries to feed their nestlings. And there's even more shrubs. And if we added at the other end, if this list went all the way down, we would get to the tree out in front of the library here in Shelton, where I live, is a ornamental ginkgo tree. It's from Japan. It's been the most gorgeous golden color for a week. Half the leaves just fell off on command today, but there are only 4 species of insects in Connecticut that could feed on those, on the leaves of a ginkgo. So as a bird food source, it's definitely not one we should keep around. This list, if you're interested, comes from Doug Tallamy's research. So searching for his website, you can get to that larger list and see where the other plants in your yard may actually fit on there. There are a few native plants that do have a low list. Things like spice bush have a lot of compounds in the leaves that make it difficult for native insects to feed on it. So I think it's only in the 10 to 15 species of insects, but those insects who are eating it, it is pretty much their only food source. Spice bush swallowtail can only feed on spice bush and on sassafras trees. So we need to have some of that diversity of plants around us too. I saw the chat. I only noticed that one at the right time for someone recommending bee balm, but are there any other questions here? Michelle, I will comment on the photos. Please note all of the photo credits in the corner of the photos. Almost all of them were entries in the Audubon Photography Awards. And when people submit for that photo, end up checking a box to say that those photos can be used for Audubon purposes, primarily for education programs. And there are a few others that come from Doug Tallamy, because he has an amazing presentation, if you've never seen him, on being able to classify how those plants are attracting more bugs to attract more birds. Are there species of willow readily available at nurseries? I believe black willow is the larger native species, going to be a little bit tougher to find. Weeping willows certainly are going to be found at a variety of nurseries, as well as the pussy willow shrubs are another great one that people are more familiar with as an ornamental in their yards. And Gianna asks which magnolia species are native to Connecticut. I'm trying to get this right. The star and sarsa magnolia are native to the southeast. The cucumber magnolia is the one that reaches into New York State in range and not truly to Connecticut. Yes, Michelle was actually already clarifying that it's not truly native, but we consider it a friendly neighbor, is a phrase that many of us are using to clarify that someday it may be part of its range to be native to Connecticut. Great. We're wrapping up the fall season, and you may have noticed some of this behavior of birds in the shrubs in your yard or local parks. But what we have are amazing number of shrubs and trees that their flowering happens in the spring to bring enjoyment to us, and the berries ripen in the late summer, early fall, the perfect timing for birds to eat them on their migration south. In many of our native species, the berries are inherently higher in content with fat and proteins, which are the makes them more higher in caloric value, and that's what the birds find as being extremely valuable. Things like many of the viburnums fit this group. Arrowwood Viburnum, and this one I believe goes by the nickname of Nannyberry. Here is a slightly larger. So all these berries are on our native shrubs are a perfect size for our thrushes or smaller birds. And there are a few ornamental trees with berries in the fall, but the berries are too large for our birds to eat them. Here's Arrowwood Viburnum. You can see it gets some interesting fall foliage of a real burgundy red color. Has a dark blue berry, and I recall last year during COVID, I did lead one small group walk, and we found a red-eyed vireo sitting on the Arrowwood Viburnums right below the barn at the bend of the river. And it was one of the first birds we saw that morning. We went for another hour and a half around the meadow and into the shrublands. We came back, and there was a red-eyed vireo in that same exact spot in the shrub. Can't say for certain it was the same bird, but it likely was, sitting there and fueling up for the next night of migration. Dogwoods are ripening at the right time. The red stem dogwoods are more preferred for their color value, for our enjoyment, but for the birds, gray dogwood has an amazing number, is a host plant for an amazing number of insects, and those berries are something that the birds can really key in on. Gray dogwood, just as a side effect or side note, gray dogwood grows an amazing number of conditions, so it isn't one you might find at most landscape nurseries. But instead, if you have a place where you're, it can be found for more industrial landscapers because it's used for quickly replanting on hillsides or banks of rivers to prevent erosion. There's an interesting plant in the middle of all that list of viburnums, the cranberry leaf viburnum, or cranberry viburnum, many people know it as, with bright red berries. And you may notice that it still has all of its berries on it. And you think back that Ken and other people have said, oh, the viburnums are a great fall food source. This one plant out of all that group has a very high sugar content and a very low fat content. Somehow the birds learn right away and they avoid eating it this time of year. It's one that is, I guess, unpalatable to the birds overall. And I just learned a few weeks ago from Steve Kress, who was the author of one of the original Audubon guides to attracting birds, and the founder of Project Puffin. He's found that there is pollen from some of our aspen trees in the spring. The birds can eat that pollen, and then it is creating a digestive condition that they can then eat those berries. So we might see them persisting all the way through the winter into the spring. Here are some of the other, at the top in the red are Multiflora rose and Japanese honeysuckle are not native, and they are very low in fat content. So their energy content for birds getting ready to migrate is very low. Some of them might eat it during the winter when there's nothing else available. Down at the bottom in the green, viburnum, spicebush, and the dogwoods are extremely valuable for their caloric content for birds. Also on the list, northern bayberry is one that lasts, is a persistent winter fruit. So we'll talk about it more in a moment, but also being that high 50% fat content, that's why it's also known for its ability to be used in candle making in particular. Native to south of here, but an interesting choice to add to your yard, and we've added to our demonstration site at the bend of the river, is beautyberry. Our friends at Audubon, North Carolina, love this plant for birds when it's migrating through North Carolina. It's got an interesting cluster of flowers around the stem. As you can see on either side of this female black-throated blue warbler are the berries. Imagine that it was a small cluster of flowers in the midsummer, and then those berries are ripening. Usually this year it was kind of late, but that is a very interesting color. And even we think of black-throated blue warblers as being insectivores. During migration, they're looking for berries, and they seem to be attracted to colors, and also that small size is much better for them than, say, the invasive porcelain berry is a bright blue color at the same time of year. We've talked a lot about trees and shrubs, but some of our other flowers and perennials are great sources of food. That goldenrod is a great nectar source for butterflies before they're migrating south, or for any of those late season flying butterflies. Goldenrod's one of our last blooming flowers. So it is really imperative for some of these insects to be able to have it in the habitats around it. Goldenrod, because it's such a great attractant of many pollinators and the butterflies, then it also attracts a variety of other insects, a lot of mimics, but also a lot of predator insects. And it's a literal safari when you pull apart the branches of the goldenrod, if you're able to see all of those insects in there. That makes for great foraging areas for those insectivores that are migrating and prefer not to eat berries if they don't have to. So it can be a great source of finding all those fall warblers too. Moving on to right about our season now, end of fall, early winter. We're going to notice that there are some berries that have persisted on the shrubs, and there are birds to survive the winter, which will be our topic to talk about in January, is that birds have their mechanisms for surviving the cold, and that means they need more calories. Certain fruits like winterberry, there needs to be a series of cold and warm cycles to concentrate the sugars, which then make it more palatable to the birds. And that's why we see it and we can enjoy it through the early winter as an ornamental, and putting it in our reeds and things like that, that we can then know that it will be a food source for the birds later through the winter. For birds like the mockingbird, even cardinals will feed on those berries as the winter progresses. See, I was thinking about adding the cardinal. I don't have my speaker notes up, so I'm not seeing the preview of the next slide. Bayberry is a great plant to add, especially if you have a spot near sidewalks or driveways. And if you're looking for anything that might create a hedge effect, Bayberry is a great choice. It can have a pretty thick growth pattern. And if you've ever visited Audubon Greenwich, our hedges blocking the edge of the driveway at the building is a 30, almost 40-foot long section of Bayberry. And it's wonderful to visit in the early fall as you hear all the little kissing chip notes of yellow-rumped warblers going through there. And sometimes they're feeding on those berries then, and they'll be feeding on those berries when they arrive back in March as well. So you saw in that chart, very high fat content, and they can have a very abundant growth of berries that we don't notice. And most of the birds are ignoring it as well, but those early spring migrants seem to be able to recognize it, and this shrub is probably responsible for saving populations of birds who arrive too early in the spring, or when we've had a fall spring and then have a late season snow or ice storm. This is the type of plant that helps support those birds through that tough weather conditions. Oh, when I was saying near the driveway, near the sidewalk, it naturally grows on our dunes. So it is extremely salt tolerant, something that can be a challenge at times with certain landscaping conditions. So a great plant to add for those spots that nothing else will seem to grow because it's where the snow piles up. I had an interview a few weeks ago with one of the local papers in Northwestern Connecticut, and birds in nature like things to be messy. So it's a great excuse to be lazy with putting our flower beds to rest for the winter. Leaving all of those stems provides lots of seed sources for sparrows and finches, but also in those stems, there are a lot of overwintering insects, things that we might overlook, and the birds are actually looking for them in there through the winter, or it's helping provide those the right part of the life cycle for the next generation of insects next spring. Some of our, this looks like it was ironweed and Joe Pye are some of the plants that will have great seeds throughout the winter. And rattlesnake master is this one that looks like a burr almost here on the right. Grasses can also help support our birds, especially during the winter with the seed sources for sparrows in particular. This is a little blue stem, and you can notice the great purplish red color on the stems as well. So it can bring some enjoyment. It grows in clumps, so it can be a great addition to some gardens because it has a great growth pattern rather than becoming a complete mat. And there's also a lot of small butterflies and moths that their caterpillars feed on it. It's a host plant for a lot of our butterflies. We also find our buntings hanging out in the little blue stem at the bend of the river throughout most of the seasons. I know you have a couple specific questions in the chat box, but by this point, people are also in their minds asking, so what plants are native to this area? Or what birds can I want to attract Orioles? So which plants are best for Orioles? Or where can I get them locally? Luckily, you have a great support system right here for sourcing them. But if you're not familiar with it, Audubon has a database called the Plants for Birds database, and going to audubon.org/native plants. And if you just in Google type in Audubon plants, you'll immediately get to this website. And I need to click through this way. There we go. This is a slide, a photo of the website. You put in your zip code, and this could be great help if you're supporting family members in other areas who are thinking about I know I had relatives in Pittsburgh and in Seattle that I got them gift certificates. I went and found the local places near them. And you can choose what types of plants that you're looking specifically for, grasses or shrubs or an evergreen. And then you can also sort it by what type of food sources it's producing, whether it's fruit or whether it's going to be a great source of caterpillars for birds. And you can also choose groups of birds that you want to attract, and it will help narrow down those choices of which plants are better for which types of birds. After you have your list of birds, you can, or sorry, of plants, you can look across the top and you can see a full list of results, or you could go to the local resources. In there, you'll get a list of the Audubon chapters like Mononkatuk that are nearby, or the Bent to the River office to call or email for a few more questions. And also, if you scroll down, you'll get a list of nurseries that have worked with Audubon that we know are supplying many native plants. Most commercial nurseries are not supporting just native plants yet. Many of them also use nativars, which is a cultivar of natives. So you do need to ask questions, but also going to the nurseries closest to you and asking if they have those plants. The more they hear the questions of it, the more likely that they will try and stock some of it. We have one larger wholesaler who our Audubon colleagues went, and when they started to ask for the list of plants, the staff there kind of that they first encountered didn't know anything, but they immediately called the manager going, there's another one of those bird plant people here. So they were getting the concept, and then they the manager was able to come out, and he does have stock that was able to support them, our team. And so you can get to see a map even of where these different retailers are. There are a few that are online as well. And those are all sources that we're trying to update that site. And if you have a source that you know of that isn't on the website, but would like to recommend to us, please contact Dennis or myself, because we would love to add that and support those businesses that are supporting birds by supporting the right types of plants. And one place nearby, you heard Dennis mentioning it, and I hope you're seeing it in all of those wonderful newsletters from the Mononkatuk Audubon chapter, is the efforts of the Urbanscapes native plant nursery in the New Hallville neighborhood of New Haven that Dennis, along with the CPEN and the local residents that they're employing, were able to produce those 2,000 plants this year. 500 will be starting the stock for next season. They now have a greenhouse, and it is the only native plant nursery in the city of New Haven. I did see somebody add to the chat, for those of you east of the Veterans Memorial Bridge, I almost said the Q Bridge, there's Nature Works over there in the Northford area, I believe. If you're north and west of New Haven, then in Woodbury is Earth Tones, is currently the only all native plant nursery. Broken Arrow Nurse in Hamden does have a lot of native plants. They also specialize in being one of the researchers of nativars. So they do have a lot of cultivars. So asking them what type of stock it is something I ask when I do visit, because I did end up, when they donated some plants for one of my schoolyard projects, they gave us some cultivars of echinacea, for example, and it was all white flowers with weird shaped petals. And when I planted it and then planted some mountain mint next to it, none of the pollinators went to the non-traditional echinacea. They went for the mountain mint instead. There, now I can leave the slide up for the questions. Scroll back up here. Thank you, Dennis, for adding links along the way, like Doug Talamy's website. And yes, you can find gray dogwood was the plant he was mentioning. You would be able to find at Urbanscapes, not available at most other nurseries. Is beautyberry okay? And it is supported by a lot of other Audubon groups. So while it's not truly native to here, we have not found any evidence of it being invasive in Connecticut, and it has been, we noticed a lot of the birds eating it, which is another great sign. Gianna asked about advice for removing porcelain berry. Earlier in the season, you can treat it the better. And it does have a lot of roots that are nearly impossible to get all of those roots up. Also, when you're pulling it, it seems to snap on me in particular. Another key thing is, depending on when you've noticed it, is if you could bag up the berries, depending on the size of the growth of it in your yard. That's one thing we did immediately, was that we bagged it, and then we went out at different time when we had more volunteers to actually pull the plant out. But we made sure that we weren't spreading it across the property any further. And I'm reading from Lori here. Support for working with a condo board to be able to start replacing invasive shrubs with native plants. It is a challenge. Many people think that natives, because the price tag on them might be more expensive long-term, their maintenance is actually lower than a lot of them. Can be one of the ways we can explain that they're a better investment. And also, if they've got things like bears or things like that, our reasons to have natives are a great choice. And if you email me, Lori, I know we've emailed before, I have another Audubon volunteer in Cheshire who has actually had wonderful success with her condo board. I think she got actively involved, and it helped that she was willing to do most of the work herself, but she would have some other great suggestions I could ask her for. Michelle, thank you. I have not shared this presentation in a while, so I appreciate you being there and contributing to the chat tonight and confirming some of my ability to answer some of the and remembering names of everything. So thank you. I appreciate that. Great. And any other questions, feel free to type in, or we're a small enough group, you could come off of mute if typing into chat. I know some people might be watching on an iPad or something, and getting to the chat is difficult. So at this point, Dennis, if you want to switch it to letting people be unmute themselves, that's more than welcome to do that to ask a question.
Sure, they can unmute themselves. There's no problem with that. Small group.
Ken, I really appreciate this presentation, because I've been reading that we should migrate towards less bird feeders and more making our yard bird friendly, as you suggest, because that also provides habitat and really important shelter and other benefits that a bird feeder doesn't. So I'm trying it this year. I'm not using bird feeders at all. So this presentation has come just at the right time to help me focus on getting a few more new species. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. There's one other piece of research I didn't add to this presentation, is that for our feeder birds that we enjoy, chickadees and cardinals, in suburban DC area, they've learned that the neighborhood needs to have at least 70% native plants to support a viable breeding population of birds, that their nestlings are not going to fledge at a successful rate if there are less than 70% native plants in that neighborhood. I think that alone might make people realize that the impact they're having on what they would consider their birds. And that bird feeders help you get to see the bird for a short amount of time, but it might not be doing the birds justice long-term to have the right support.
Yes, one of the questions I have about, I've heard that statistic from Doug Tallamy about the percentage of native, but for example, I have 3 huge oak trees on my 1/4 acre property. So I feel I've got 95% right there. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what else I have planted. Well, it does, but I mean, those oaks are the keystone, really.
True. There are some of our birds like song sparrows and mourning doves who may not forage that high if you have only higher canopy of those oaks.
That's a really good point, Ken. I do have a lot of blueberries, shadbush.
Oh, there we go.
Elderberry, dogwood.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. Mary is asking, is bayberry something I could use to replace rhododendrons gradually? Yeah, you could use bayberry, especially because it's that hedge effect. I feel like it stays somewhat evergreen, not perfectly, but it's certainly better than a blueberry bush if you're looking for something to have some foliage through the winter. And that's what you were looking for from your rhododendrons.
Yeah.
It won't have that same pop of color, but it will certainly do that function.
Great, thank you.
Ken, one more question. You mentioned that shrubs, many birds will forage in shrubs. I have noticed wrens in the herb layer mostly. Are there other birds that prefer the very bottom layer of that are ground feeders?
Yeah, buntings and sparrows as groups overall will feed much lower. Goldfinches in the right conditions, I find them down on the Christmas bird count in particular, I'll find them in some sort of stand of something like evening primrose or even in the monarda, if there's a big patch of it in a field. And others will go and feed lower as well, like cardinals, mourning doves are the ones that I think immediately.
Thank you.
And what plants support non-songbirds like crows, turkeys, etc.? Interesting question, Gianna. Right. So any of those plants that are great host plants for caterpillars are going to help with the breeding population, with the nesting for any of our larger birds. Then having oaks and beech and hickories that are producing larger mast is the phrase for wildlife food. So in hard mast being nuts, then those are things that crows and turkeys are using a lot in the late season to make sure that they're going to be healthy for the overwintering. Turkeys don't really cache their food, but they're very good at foraging and finding new sources throughout the season. I wouldn't go planting many herbaceous plants or shrubs for them, but making sure that they have those trees nearby would be good. Lori's asking, do I know if there's any reason why the state parks removed their bird feeders? They do have a lot of great habitat nearby. Was it because of the bird disease? They may have taken them down for the bird disease. Also, the bend to the river, if you come and visit, there will be days that the feeders aren't up. And that's because just like state parks, we're not staffed fully since COVID, that we still have a lot of work from home conditions. And we didn't replace many of our seasonal or maintenance staff immediately after shutting down. So we're reopening slowly, and I think that might be the case. I don't want to speak for them, but I think that's part. I know they immediately took them down to set the example like we were.
I'm on the Friends Board at Sherwood Island State Park, and we depend on volunteers to stock those feeders. and they are often buying the bird food themselves. So donations to Friends of Sherwood Island that are mentioned as please provide bird food, we give that money to the people who do that. So sometimes it takes some action from an outside group to get those bird feeders filled in state parks.
And there is discussion that they might be down at all state parks. May have been that I know the state of Connecticut was one of those that was definitely erred on the side of caution. So they took them down, and they might just decide not to put them back up. Patty has a great question. Are there any Audubon or other conservation programs that work with cities to help them plan their landscapes that require little maintenance that are good for birds and pollinators? That's a big ask, and a lot of it comes back to many of our cities have underfunded parks programs at the moment, is what we are finding. But instead, we're finding success where we can. And in New Haven in particular, Audubon has worked with many of the other groups in New Haven to create urban oases. That we have 17 sites at parks that are demonstration sites, but also creating healthier habitats within each of the city parks. So Beaver Pond Park in particular feels like an oasis for birds when you're able to walk there. And ones like the Learning Corridor are not as large, but they are there for people to see and realize that we should have more native plants around. And we've also done that with schoolyards. There's a growing group internationally known as Bird Friendly Cities. It's based out of a professor from the University of Virginia. So there are some cities that are thinking on a bigger landscape scale. And if you want any other success stories of how thinking about city planning to support birds, our colleagues at New York City Audubon Society have had some great success, not only with creating and maintaining habitat, but also reducing the hazards that an urban environment create for birds. Thank you, everyone. I'll stick around for another minute or two, but I'll be joining you again in January, and also we're local, so we can chat other times as well. Thanks for sharing all those links, Dennis, and keeping that conversation going. The Bird Friendly City. There is a webinar on Audubon Connecticut's website that you could see a recording of it. I'm going to pull up the website and put in the link for all of our. There you go. If you're still here, you can see the recordings of all of our monthly webinars, and we had Thomas Beatley just last spring.
If you want to save all these links, I believe you can, in the chat, click on the 3 dots at the bottom of the chat window and click Save Chat. It'll save it as a text file.
That's better than scrolling and trying to click on everything and opening up all the tabs.
True.
Thank you.
Any other last minute questions? Okay, thanks all. Next month, Pat Lynch with geology of Connecticut and its relationship to wildlife. Hope to see you then. Register on our website. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks so much. It was great. Thanks, Ken.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you very much.
That was helpful.
Bye.
Bye-bye. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, good night.